The bullet shattered Maximilien Robespierre's jaw to such a degree that fragments of bone would fall from his mouth every time he attempted to speak. For 14 agonizing hours, the man responsible for the execution of 17,000 people struggled with the very fate he had dispensed to others. By 1792, Robespierre had come to view anyone who disagreed with him as an enemy of the people. Those who dared question his methods were deemed corrupt, and any show of mercy was labeled as treachery. In April 1793, he established the Committee of Public Safety, transforming it within 6 months into one of the most efficient killing machines in European history. Every morning at 9 a.m., the committee convened in a room overlooking the Seine. By 10 a.m., they had decided who would die that day. The statistics were staggering. Between September 1793 and July 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal sentenced 2,639 individuals to death in Paris alone. In Lyon, 1,880 people faced execution. In Toulon, 282. And in Nantes, prisoners were loaded onto barges and sunk in the Loire River when the guillotines could not keep up. The bodies would float downstream for weeks, swollen and unrecognizable, eventually washing up on banks up to 32 kilometers away. Towns, untouched by revolutionary soldiers, began to receive complaints about the horrific stench. Robespierre meticulously documented each execution, maintaining records that detailed names, ages, occupations, and supposed crimes with the precision of an accountant, a baker who charged too much for bread. Guillotine, a priest who refused to swear loyalty to the state? Guillotine, a woman who complained about the food shortage? Guillotine. A 14-year-old boy who shouted, "Long live the king!" during a street fight? Guillotine. An elderly nobleman who could not walk to the scaffold and had to be carried? Guillotine. A pregnant woman who begged to live until her child was born? Guillotine. She was executed immediately after her plea was denied. Each morning, guards would read from Robespierre's list to prisoners crowded into cells meant for half their number. The condemned were loaded onto wooden carts and paraded through streets filled with jeering crowds hurling trash, stones, and human waste. The journey from prison to scaffold took exactly 45 minutes. At the Place de la Revolution, executioner Charles Henry Sanson would position each victim beneath the blade with practiced efficiency. The crowd would count down from 10. The blade would fall, the head would drop into a wicker basket, and the body would be disposed of in a mass grave filled with quicklime. Robespierre attended very few executions personally, yet he read detailed reports of each one, maintaining a journal in which he recorded not only the names of the dead, but also their final words and their behavior at the scaffold. When former Queen Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16, 1793, Robespierre remarked that her composure showed she had never truly grasped the suffering of the French people. Upon the execution of his former ally Georges Danton on April 5, 1794, he noted that Danton's pleas for mercy revealed his fundamental corruption. By early 1794, Robespierre was sleeping just 3 hours a night and had developed a nervous twitch that caused his left eye to blink uncontrollably during speeches. He disappeared from public view, except for official ceremonies, and his voice became high-pitched and shrill. Members of the committee observed him arguing with unseen adversaries and occasionally laughing at jokes no one else could hear. His landlord's daughter recalled the sound of him pacing in his room until dawn, rehearsing speeches to empty chairs. He began carrying a loaded pistol everywhere, placing it on the table during committee meetings. His once neat handwriting devolved into erratic scrawls, filled with ink stains from pressing too hard, scribbling errors and marginal notes that made no sense. He often wrote a single phrase over and over again in his private journal: "The Republic of Virtue will triumph." Sometimes he would repeat it up to 50 times on a single page. Under a new law, trials could last as little as 15 minutes, and the accused were forbidden from having lawyers, facing only 2 possible verdicts: acquittal or death. Following the law's passage, executions nearly tripled, increasing from 5 per day to 15. But this time, Robespierre's overreach sparked alarm. Members of the National Convention recognized that, if they didn't act, they would all end up on his infamous list. Joseph Fouché, Paul Barras, and Jean Lambert Tallien secretly convened at Barris's apartment to plan what they deemed the necessary action. They knew that they had only one chance fail, and Robespierre would execute them within 24 hours. Succeed, and they could halt the terror. Their plan was straightforward. Convince enough members of the convention that Robespierre intended to arrest them all and act more swiftly than he could react. On July 27, 1794, the day began like any other during the Reign of Terror. Robespierre rose at 5 a.m., perused reports from provincial committees, and prepared a speech defending his policies. Unbeknownst to him, 43 members of the convention had signed an agreement to denounce him the moment he entered the room. When Robespierre arrived at the convention at noon, clad in his signature blue coat and powdered white wig, he was confident he could outmaneuver any opposition. This time would be different. As he stood to speak, shouts echoed from every corner of the room. For the first time in 3 years, the members of the convention no longer feared challenging him openly. "Down with the tyrant!" came the call from the back. "You are the enemy of the people," shouted another. As Robespierre attempted to respond, his voice drowned in a rhythmic chant of "Death to Robespierre! Death to Robespierre!" The man who had instilled terror in France remained silent as his former allies dismantled him with the same ruthless efficiency he had once wielded against his enemies. When the guards moved in to arrest him, Robespierre seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would dare to oppose him. So accustomed had he become to absolute power that he could scarcely comprehend what was unfolding. "You cannot arrest virtue," he shouted as they seized his arms. "I am the representative of the people." But the representatives of the people dragged him from the room as the applause of the crowd outside erupted, their cheers carrying 6 blocks away. Robespierre was taken to the Luxembourg prison, yet the warden refused to admit him, fearful of housing such a dangerous prisoner. The guards then attempted to take him to the conciergerie, where Marie Antoinette had met her end, but officials there also refused him entry. For 3 hours, they dragged Robespierre from prison to prison while he insisted that his arrest was unjust and demanded to speak with the Committee of Public Safety. Finally, they brought him to the Hôtel de Ville, where his brother Augustin and loyal supporters had gathered to stage a rescue. Inside, Robespierre penned what he believed would be his final speech, a fervent defense of his actions aimed at rallying the people of Paris to his cause. He was convinced that once the citizens understood the gravity of his situation, they would rise against his enemies, just as they had once risen against the king. Deep down, he still believed he was the true voice of France. When Robespierre's supporters attempted to march on the convention, they found the streets nearly deserted. The sans-culottes, who had once rallied behind him enthusiastically, opted to stay home, while the National Guard units that came to disperse the crowd encountered negligible resistance. By 2 a.m., it became evident that Robespierre's rescue had utterly failed. The man who had claimed to speak for the people discovered that those very people had finally ceased to listen. Around 3 a.m. on July 28th, as convention forces stormed the Hôtel de Ville, a gunshot rang out from the room where Robespierre was writing his speech. Witness accounts varied. Some claimed it was a suicide attempt, while others reported that a guard shot him by accident, or that it was a young deputy, Charles-André Merda, who intentionally fired. The consensus lay in the result. The bullet fractured Robespierre's jaw, entering through his mouth, and exiting through his left cheek, leaving him unable to articulate anything beyond a whisper. The wounded Robespierre was discovered lying in a pool of blood on a wooden table, still conscious but barely able to breathe. A military surgeon named Pierre-François Percy examined him, declaring his jaw broken in 3 places and several teeth lost, yet the wound wasn't immediately fatal. Someone wrapped his head in bandages torn from a tablecloth, and the guards transported him to the headquarters of the Committee of Public Safety, where he would spend the next 14 hours waiting for death. In those final hours, Robespierre experienced precisely the kind of psychological torture he had inflicted upon thousands. The certainty of death, with the uncertainty of when it might arrive. He sat in the very chair where he had signed death sentences for friends, foes, and strangers alike, his shattered jaw preventing him from speaking clearly as he listened to former colleagues celebrating his downfall in the next room. Every few hours, someone would check on him, usually to ask if he had any final words or wished to confess his crimes against the French people. Robespierre attempted to respond, but only blood and incoherent sounds escaped him. News of his impending execution spread through Paris overnight, and by 6 a.m., people were camping out to secure prime spots for the spectacle at the scaffold. Street vendors sold bread, wine, and pastries to spectators who treated the event like a grand celebration. Children scampered through the throng, reenacting Robespierre's fate with mock executions, while women knitted in anticipation, echoing the atmosphere of previous executions. Yet this crowd was different. They were no longer mere bloodthirsty spectators. These were individuals who had endured 16 months of terror, finally free to voice their collective hatred. People shared tales of friends and relatives who had perished during the reign of terror, comparing grievances on the policies that had wrought suffering upon them. Some carried portraits of executed relatives, holding them aloft like banners. Others brought crude effigies of Robespierre, prepared to burn them following the execution. Street musicians played songs satirizing the fallen dictator, while amateur poets recited verses celebrating his downfall. Prostitutes humorously offered free services to anyone who could spin a convincing yarn about how Robespierre had wronged them personally. At around 4 p.m., the guards loaded Robespierre and 21 of his supporters onto death carts for their journey to the Place de la Révolution. The trip, which typically took 45 minutes, extended nearly 2 hours due to the dense crowds blocking the streets, hurling insults and debris. "There goes the monster!" the people shouted. "Look at the tyrant now!" Others sang revolutionary songs, altering the lyrics to mock Robespierre's fall, while children dashed alongside the cart, spitting on the prisoners and striking them with sticks. Robespierre's bandages were sodden with blood, his blue coat tattered and stained, and his once famous white wig gone, revealing hair that had grayed under the strain of paranoid insomnia. He could not lift his head due to his jaw injury, so he slumped forward, chin resting against his chest, occasionally casting his eyes toward the crowd without making direct contact with any particular individual. This was the man who had once commanded silence with a mere gesture, now reduced to just another broken prisoner on his way to the guillotine. When the cart finally reached the scaffold, the roar of the crowd was so deafening that the guards had to shout directly into one another's ears to communicate. Estimates suggested that 200,000 people had crammed into every available space: windows, rooftops, balconies, and lampposts. Some spectators had paid exorbitant prices for seats that promised a better view of the execution, while others climbed trees or stood atop one another's shoulders. The energy in the air was unparalleled. Instead of the cold, bloodthirsty anticipation that had shaped previous executions, the crowd radiated pure joy and exhilaration. As the guards pulled Robespierre from the cart, the crowd erupted in approval, their cheers so loud that some nearby windows shattered. The final moment arrived when Sansone's assistant tore away the blood-soaked bandages that had covered Robespierre's wound for 14 hours. The sudden removal of the makeshift dressing caused his broken jaw to open wide, eliciting a scream that witnesses described as inhuman. For a brief moment, an immense silence enveloped the crowd, stunned by the raw agony of a man who had once seemed almost supernatural in power. Then someone shouted, "That's the scream of all his victims!" And the crowd's cheers surged again, even louder. Sanson later reported that the execution itself proceeded without incident. The blade fell cleanly, severing the head instantly, resulting in immediate death. Yet what followed was unprecedented in the annals of the revolution. Instead of the usual brief cheer that followed a beheading, followed by a scattering of the crowd, the masses erupted into wild celebration that lasted for hours. People danced in the streets, sang songs, embraced strangers, and shared wine. Street vendors peddled souvenirs, claiming to have drops of Robespierre's blood or bits of the guillotine. The revelry continued well into the early hours of the morning, as news of Robespierre's death spread to every major city in France, igniting spontaneous celebrations across the nation. In Lyon, where nearly 1,880 had perished during the terror, citizens constructed a bonfire from the furniture of executed nobles, tossing in effigies of Robespierre. In Marseille, church bells rang relentlessly for 6 straight hours while ships fired cannons in jubilant salute. In Bordeaux, wine merchants opened their finest bottles and distributed them freely to all eager to toast the fall of the tyrant. The sound of celebration echoed from one end of France to the other, marking the end of an era of terror and the dissolution of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to support our work. Never miss an upload. Like this vid, drop a comment and share it with others to help us grow this historical community.